All right, let's resume with lecture 6. So far I talked about essentially one side of this idea of the socioeconomic space, namely this embeddedness. I talked really a lot about the use of institutions and the role of institutions with regard to creating socioeconomic roles and the creation of interactions through those socioeconomic roles. Now I want to go to the other side of the coin, the other side of the socioeconomic space, and that is that what I call the entrepreneurial function. And this entrepreneurial function is this desire to change things. When we use things, we would like to change them. This is very human. And we see the problems with it and deficiencies, and we try to make it better. And not all entrepreneurial activity or all change is good. Change can also be bad. And that is very much what I want to emphasize throughout the debate here. The change is not necessarily progressive, as we call that. It can also be regressive. Yeah. All right, to recap, the socioeconomic space is a theoretical construction that captures the functioning of the social division of labor in all its detail, in some sense. And the three constituting elements are economic agents and economic interactions, and then these institutions that govern all these interactions and in which we participate. And this embeddedness we emphasize very much as such. Yeah. So this was the picture. I go back to the original picture. I don't want to use necessarily the amended picture that I developed before. But then we have this other arrow, the entrepreneurial function arrow, and that refers to this desire to change things. When things are not functioning very well, I mean, what do we do? Yeah. It really is a force. That's how I understand it. Like embeddedness is like gravity. Gravity is a force. Entrepreneurial activity is the opposite of that. It's something that repels, but it is also a force. Yeah. So it is a repelling kind of force. It is something that you want to push away that institution. You want to change that institution. You don't want to submit to it. And there are many, many periods in economic history and periods in history in general where change and the desire for change is very, very strong. And those are those episodes where things are not functioning very well. So we try to change things. Yeah. So all change and development of the socioeconomic space from an institutional perspective is subject to that entrepreneurship, that entrepreneurial function. Yeah. And so I think of entrepreneurship in a much broader way than it is usually used, right? Entrepreneurship, there are several perspectives on it. The first one is the daily life perspective, so to say, how we talk about it in our daily life and what we see on the news and what is debated in newspapers and what is at the coffee tables, so to say, used is a certain perspective on entrepreneurship. And then we have the management science perspective on entrepreneurship. And the management science perspective is also quite limited. And then there is the economic theoretical perspective on entrepreneurship. And this was very important in the development of economics in the 20th century. And Schumpeter is one of the outstanding contributors here. He is well known for his work on entrepreneurship and understanding what entrepreneurship is and means. And he built that into a theory of economic development. And I build essentially on that. And I make it much broader because Schumpeter had a very narrow conception of entrepreneurship. He was mainly talking about technological change, technological development. And this goes back to this Ricardian understanding of wealth creation, right? That the increasing returns to specialization are based on talent, and that individual abilities can be developed and enhanced, and as a consequence, you create more wealth. However, there are other things that create much more wealth. There's networking, building networks themselves, and there's also the institutions directly. You can directly change the institution by introducing new laws, by introducing new regulation, for example. That is usually seen as a work by governments, governmental activities, but it has direct bearing on the functioning of our economy. And as such, it is entrepreneurial. That is so governments are entrepreneurial in their very deep understanding, right? So that is very important to realize. Okay, so I want to emphasize that what I understand the entrepreneurial function to be is quite different from what is called entrepreneurship or the entrepreneur, right? I really want to emphasize that. Okay, so it is important to realize that we talk about quite different things. Entrepreneurship is a more limited form of this entrepreneurial function. It is punctuating, as we call that. It is leading to direct change. It is not something that is very, very slow and takes time to develop. It is something that is immediate, boom. It's like a hit. That is entrepreneurship. And it is usually individualistic. It is one person that does it. It's Steve Jobs inventing the iPhone. And that is a punctuating entrepreneurial activity that is done by one individual. And so it is individualistic and punctuating. And so it can be really called entrepreneurship in a more narrow form. However, the entrepreneurial function includes also things that go very slowly. Over time, things slowly change. After the Black Death hit the feudal economy in the 14th century and wiped out between 1/3 and half of the working population of the continent of Europe. This was, of course, an enormous punch, but nevertheless, the consequences of that, it set in motion a machinery of change that worked for centuries. That is how it is understood in economic history, that there was this very slow change that started with that event of Black Death and very slowly changed the economy and ultimately led to the creation of capitalism, right? So there is even punctuating events can lead to slow change. And that so change is not necessarily carried by one individual that does it. It involves all of us. It involves multiple generations of people to do things slightly differently than before. Yeah. So this brings me then to economic development. I think you can categorize economic development, as I said before, from three different perspectives, namely population growth. We talked about that. We talked about technological development, and we talked about institutional development. The deepening of the social division of labor is an institutional development. This increased productivity with regard to individual productive abilities, that is technological development. That is Ricardian. Institutional development is more Smithian, as I talked about last time. However, all of these things are related to entrepreneurship. They are related to entrepreneurial activity. Namely, technological development usually goes together with institutional development. Socioeconomic roles change because productivities change. So the secondary effects are always institutional, and that change is entrepreneurial. So population growth itself, by itself, is not necessarily entrepreneurial, of course not. But the second order effects are entrepreneurial because there might be other changes following, and there might be institutional changes if the population is growing. Technological development, there's even a stronger link to that secondary effect, right? If I change my abilities to bake bread, I probably will induce other changes that are a consequence of that change. Yeah? So if I invent a machine in my bakery that makes baking bread easier, like a big mixer for dough, well, I can inspire another person to become a mixer producer. I can become an instigator for entrepreneurial change. Somebody starts to produce that product, that machine, and that machine will change the way that we bake bread, and the whole baking industry will change, and there will be a deepening of the social division labor as a consequence. There will be suddenly this new role of producer of dough mixers, so to say. Yeah, and this is institutional. So entrepreneurship is directly related to institutional development, the deepening of the social division of labor, but it might be also a secondary effect of technological development and even of population growth. So that is how we should see entrepreneurship in this context. Yeah. The main tool of the entrepreneur or entrepreneurship or the entrepreneurial function is that socioeconomic role. You are building the socioeconomic role. And when you do that, when you are seeking a new role or you're changing something in the new role, it can also be called adaptive specialization. Adaptive specialization is that you adapt your role, you modify your role. Adaptive specialization stands in contrast to what we used the word specialization so far. And that is also can also be called objective specialization. These are well-defined professions, well-defined socioeconomic roles. Adaptive specialization refers to this seeking to change, seeking new economic roles, maybe even. Yeah, and so this is very different as a consequence. Adaptive versus objective specialization. Socioeconomic role, I remind you, is this nexus of socioeconomic institutions and socioeconomic relationships. There's this network in which the socioeconomic role functions, and organizational forms that are also affected by it. Yeah. So what we have here is that the entrepreneurial function refers to agent-initiated processes of change to modify the institutions that govern the social division of labor. Yeah. So I give it a much more precise definition. And it can come to us in all kinds of different forms. And I will talk a little bit about these different forms next. First, It can be individual, but it can also be collective. It can be weak, as I call that, and punctuating. Punctuating is this hit. It can provide a hit to the whole socioeconomic space and really shock the socioeconomic space into a new state. Right? It can be progressive. It can lead to increased wealth creation, but it can also be regressive. It can lead to reduced wealth creation. Yeah. For all of these things, I will also provide some historical examples to give you an idea of what these different aspects are. However, when you have a concrete example of a change in a socioeconomic space or in an economy, usually all of these elements are there, right? Steve Jobs inventing the iPhone, well, that was a punctuating event. It was progressive. Wealth was created. It was individualistic because it was one guy that really was the big motor behind that change. He was whipping these people at Apple into creating this product because he had a certain vision. Now, however, it is also collective, it is also weak, and it is also regressive. All of these elements are there as well, but there might be much weaker. They might be secondary. It's also collective because the iPhone should be adopted by everybody. And people started to do things with these iPhones. And people started to develop apps for the iPhones. And as a consequence, we got a tremendous growth of Facebook, for example, which was an unintended consequence of the iPhone, right? It is also weak because these changes might be very modest, and accumulation of these very modest changes can still lead to significant change over time, but it might take a lot of time. Our global economy was really affected by the invention of the iPhone because the smartphone as a tool to do things and to conduct business, for example, completely changed the world. But that took time. It took up to a decade, essentially. And where are we now? We are still in the process of doing that. We can now, 10 years ago, it was not possible to do your bank business on a smartphone. But today it is. You can do all things that you can do electronically with regard to a bank, you can do now on your smartphone. You have these special apps for that. And we are still developing all this stuff. We are still progressing towards that. Yeah. It is also a destructor of wealth. This whole process also destroys things. Bank branches have been closing because we don't need them anymore. ATMs have been removed, just to stick with the example of banking. Why? Because we now pay electronically. We can even pay using our phones. It is clear that the future, we will not have bank cards anymore. We'll just have our phone. And this will destroy businesses, namely those card producing corporations. Yeah, what will they do next? ATM producers, these were complex machines, big business for certain corporations, global corporations that do these things. They need new products. They need to move on. And in some cases, they are not able to move on and they will go the way of the dinosaurs. They will die off, right? So there is always an element to entrepreneurship that is negative. There will always be certain industries that will decline and pushing up daisies in the future. Yeah, Schumpeter also recognized that, right? So creative destructionism, he calls that, right? So you create something new, and as a consequence, something old dies. Right? You're not longer having the steam engine as the main motor for propelling transportation. We moved on from that. We got the petrol engine, we got the diesel engine, and today we have the electric engine, and likely the petrol engine and the diesel engine will also go the way of the steam engine. They will become relics over time. Yeah. It's important to realize that creation goes together with destruction. Progressive goes together with regressive. Anyway, let me dwell a bit on these different aspects. Individual entrepreneurship, I refer to individual entrepreneurs. You have individual economic agents that make substantial changes in the environment that they operate in. And as a consequence, they change things for the whole economy. I identify 3 types of entrepreneurship here, right? This goes very much to the individual entrepreneurship, right? The same type of entrepreneurship can also be collective, but it comes to the fore so much more through individual entrepreneurship, and that is Schumpeterian entrepreneurship. This is Schumpeter's original inception of entrepreneurship, namely new goods, new production processes, new things that hang together with the role from a productive, from a consumptive point of view. So it is not necessarily related to the institutions directly. They are not setting out, I want to change the institutions that govern our economy. The innovation comes from profit making and to build things in a different way, to create a new economic good because you want to make more profits for certain things. Yeah? Same for production processes. The second type of entrepreneurship originates from the work of Ronald Byrd. It's a sociologist, a mathematical sociologist, in fact. He built a theory of networking, essentially, from a social point of view, and he identified was called by him to be structural holes. So networks can have structural holes where entities are interacting with each other, and there is an obvious gap. There is something missing there. It is as if there is a hole in those interactions. And those holes can be bridged, as it is called. So if you're creative, you can bridge those holes. You can leap over the long chains that are in the network. And those relationships give you new opportunities. And when you create a bridge, you can get tremendous wealth from that, right? So again, the motivation is innovation, not of the goods, not of the production processes, but of the network, the relationships, to create something new, yeah? To create a new way of doing business, for example, a new way of bringing things together. Usually that goes together with a new product, right? The iPhone is a great example. Again, you have your Facebook app. Well, that was a bridge. It was bridging gaps. You could suddenly communicate with people everywhere else in the world. And so you could leap whole oceans, literally, from Northern Ireland all the way to China, all the way to Argentina, just to name a few places, without any effort whatsoever. And this is Burtian. This software, the soft side of it is Burtian. The hardware is Schumpeterian. And then there's a third form, Baumelian. Baumel was an economist. He made many contributions to economics, and he was a kind of contrarian thinker, talking about a lot of things in the economy And he talked also about entrepreneurship. And he was very much focused on creating new behavior roles and rules and institutional innovation. So really directly the institutions, not just things that hang together with the institutions, but the institutions themselves, trade practices, means of interaction. So accepting a certain type of money, all these kind of things hanging together. Yeah. Okay, so those are the three main forms in which individual entrepreneurship takes shape. I want to make a very important remark. There is also, economists also pointed out something very important, and that is individual entrepreneurs are always lucky, and in most cases they are fools. Obvious examples of foolish, famous entrepreneurs are Henry Ford and Steve Jobs. They were impossible people. They were crazy in some sense. Yeah? And they stumbled into opportunities. Both were extremely successful and extreme failures because they were just fools. They stumbled into opportunities, but they also stumbled in huge disasters. And the order for both of them is the reverse of the other. So Henry Ford was first extremely successful and then an extreme failure because he stumbled into a golden opportunity by creating the T-Ford model and using a new production technology to do that, namely the automated production line, with an extreme social division of labor that is attached to it. And so you got those automated production processes for the very first time in production. And he was able to produce an excellent product at a very, very low cost. And he was able to sell that product because at that time his competitors were not really, they were all sleeping at the wheel, literally, and did not see this coming. And they were all building cars by hand. Cars were very expensive as a consequence. And suddenly there was this guy who was able to produce these cars at extremely low cost, and everybody suddenly could afford one. And as a consequence, there was this product that was extremely successful, and he became a near monopolist in the car market. At some point, he controlled more than 50% of the car market in the United States, which was the main car market at that time. We're talking about the 1920s now. However, the guy was a fool. He did not continue to innovate. He stuck to his product and did not create a successor. And meanwhile, of course, all the competitors woke up and they started to do the same thing. And they started to nibble away at the market share of Ford. And so in the end, he lost it all again, and it became one of a few in the consolidated industry that emerged in the 1930s. He was one of the main players still, but he was not anymore the main car producer. There were several now. General Motors also emerged at that time. And Chrysler, they were the main competitors for Ford. Now, Steve Jobs was the reverse order. He was a huge failure at first. Apple failed as a business in the 90s, came very close to bankruptcy. And he was even fired as CEO at some point. And he came back at some point because they were near bankruptcy. And as a last desperate move, they got him back as a CEO. And at that time, he came with new ideas that did not work out at all in his new venture, which was called Next the next computing or next computer was his new product. Based on the ideas from the next computer, they created the iMac, and it triggered a sequence of major Schumpeterian innovations, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, and created tremendous success for Apple. So first he was a failure, then he became a success. And it, as I expressed, the Newton, I referred to the Newton as one of those products that failed. That is because the world was not ready. He was, in some sense, ahead of himself. And he had to wait to the right moment. And he stumbled into the right moment after his failure, which is quite rare. It makes him quite a unique individual. All right, Henry Ford, I already mentioned. Thomas Edison is another one that's a contemporary of Henry Ford. They were both Schumpeterian. It is all based on new products, new production technologies. That's also was the inspiration for Schumpeter to develop the theory. John D. Rockefeller, however, is a totally different individual. He built a humongous corporation in the oil market at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, by consolidating small oil companies into one humongous monopoly. And so he was building networks. He did not invent anything. He went after people to sell him cheaply their rights to pump oil, and he was taking over their business. And he saw that opportunity, and he saw the opportunity to control the oil market before it became really important. It was before everybody had a car and everybody needed petrol. And he was way ahead of his time in some sense. And that is a signature feature of a Burtian entrepreneur. He became superbly successful. He created this Standard Oil Corporation, ESSO. It's called today now ExxonMobil to be precise. He created this humongous monopoly, and he became the richest man in the world by far, super rich, far richer than Bezos and those characters that we have today. And he was the guy that also, as a secondary effect of his success, the American government created antitrust legislation and created a brand new regulation of markets. They invented antitrust law in order to go after him. And he was forced by lawsuits based on these new laws to break up his corporation. And it set a precedent for breaking up humongous monopolies. He became, he was still the richest guy on earth, but he just has his fortune, no longer his corporation. So he had all the stock, but he did not have the control. And his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., was the guy that started to hand out the money and became, he created all kinds of charities, and he created all kinds of museums and cultural projects everywhere in the world. Became extremely successful as well. Completely different kind of success, by the way. Keynes is the quintessential example of a Baumeian entrepreneur. We know Keynes is an economist, but he was also a politician, although not in parliament, not as in government, but he was an influencer. And he created wonderful institutional designs of how governments should control the economy. And they were extremely successful and extremely successfully implemented in the global economy after World War II. So he is an extremely important thinker that through his networking also, of course, he was able to sell these ideas and to really influence the creation of all these institutions. Then we go to people that mix it up, so to say. Steve Jobs is also Schumpeterian in nature, but he is also Burtian and he is also Baumollian, because there's so much change hanging around Steve Jobs. Bill Gates is the same, but he did not invent a lot of new products. He is Burtian in nature. He was able to network. He was able to make his operating system DOS the standard for IBM. And that was a pure bridging of a gap between him and Microsoft, which was a tiny corporation at the time, and this humongous hardware producer, IBM. So he is very Burtian in nature. Others who mix it up more are Giovanni de' Medici. He recreated banking completely from scratch. He was an extremely important entrepreneur in the 15th century. In Florence, he created accounting techniques, the double accounting technique was implemented by him in banking business. He was able to create new financial products, and he was an extremely successful banker who built an international banking network. And he was able to finance the international trade at that time in Europe. And he became extremely wealthy as a consequence as well. His son, Cosimo di Giovanni de' Medici, was a politician mainly, and he was able to consolidate the power of the family in Florence, and he was able to control completely the economy of Florence. And Florence at that time was, of course, an extremely important center for economic activity. So he is a Burtian entrepreneur, also Baumollian. I want to mention also the first emperor of the Roman Empire, Augustus. He created a brand new political system of governance. And as such, he's one of the biggest Baumollian entrepreneurs. He was completely redesigning the Roman Empire, and as a consequence, the Roman economy. And he created extreme stability. It was extremely unstable until he took over. And he created an extremely stable environment, extremely stable economy, and he was able to really let that Roman Empire be extremely successful. Bonaparte is another example of that. Thatcher is another example of that. I just want to mention her as well. These were extremely important with regard to the economy, and as such, they should be recognized as Baumollian entrepreneurs from an economic point of view. It's a bit contrarian, what I say now, because why should politicians be seen as entrepreneurs? But I do. I also consider Boris Johnson to be a Baumollian entrepreneur, although not in a progressive sense, but in a regressive sense. He destroys rather than creates, but he is nevertheless an influencer and a very important institutional influencer. So the laws that these guys passed are very important and the major influence on how the economy was conducted and how successful the economy was after they implemented these new institutional environments. Are there any questions? Let me take a short break of a few minutes. Then we let's return 4, and I hope to go much faster a little bit over the last slides here, because it takes way too much time. I will not dwell so much anymore on these individuals and what they did from now on, but let's come back in 5 minutes. All right. Let's continue with the collective entrepreneurship. So when groups of agents make change, then we call it a collective entrepreneurship. That is the other form, main form of entrepreneurship. Individual entrepreneurs, of course, are very famous, but there are many instances in history where major developments were created through collective effort. And usually that goes much slower than this radical entrepreneurial change that is done by individuals. But of course, individuals also rely on other people to do things, but they give leadership to the group, of course. But when I say collective entrepreneurship, I really mean a group of people that are equals in some sense. There's no clear one individual seen as the clear entrepreneurial leader, so to say. Yeah. For example, collective entrepreneurship, the success of the Dutch economy in the 16th and 17th centuries was based on a collective entrepreneurship that played in medieval Amsterdam in the 15th and 16th centuries. It was a slow process of change that involved the fishing industry and a new way to catch herring and to preserve herring in brine. Very, very successful, and that led to all kinds of developments. It led to all kinds of new industries, new forms of ships, new shipbuilding. It led to a rope industry, to all kinds of developments. And Amsterdam became a big attractor for talent, and there was enormous immigration of people, resulting in a very diverse environment, giving this enormous push to the whole Dutch economy. And that resulted in tremendous wealth in the 17th century only. And so we're talking about a process of 2 centuries. The Industrial Revolution is some similar process. It is a society essentially in a certain way that does things in a certain way. And so in Scotland, there were many Enlightenment thinkers, which were very different from the French Enlightenment thinkers. That they were social philosophers in some sense. Adam Smith was one of them. And David Hume was another. They created an environment, and they were basing themselves in an environment that was open to innovation and open to new efforts. And so in that environment, we got the success of the steam engine, the development of the steam engine, first of all. And then the big push came when James Watt improved the steam engine in such a way that it could be really used in industry and to be used in propelling trains, building locomotives. And then in Northern England, they just started to use these techniques for mining and for cloth industry. And this triggered the Industrial Revolution. So it was an environment of a certain way of doing things, a certain way of thinking, with all kinds of individuals making contributions here in very different ways to create a tremendous success for the British economy. During the French Revolution in Paris, we had the same. There was tremendous institutional innovation in Paris. They created human rights. They created new ways of thinking about the world. Individual freedom was essentially created, and that contributed tremendously to the development of capitalism. The US government in the 1930s is another one. It had it created a brand new way to look at the economy and to be able to deal with the Great Depression. And so this was the New Deal, and they implemented that in the 1930s. Coming closer to today, we had a similar collective entrepreneurship going on in the global financial industry since the 1980s. Financial innovation was extreme, and it resulted in this enormous industry, resulted in this enormous creative industry, and collapsed in 2008 in this enormous big panic that we talked about in the first week this semester. And then an ongoing process of very slow change, very with contributions of many, many individuals, which we know. Bezos, I just named, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, all these people contributed to the creation of a brand new way of conducting supply chains and creating wealth. And this we call now today the platform economy. The creation of the platform economy is a collective entrepreneurial enterprise. Collective entrepreneurship goes hand in hand with the other categorization of entrepreneurship, and that is the weak form of entrepreneurship. Weak form refers to very slow change, minor change that accumulates very slowly over time and can make huge changes. Weak entrepreneurship is nearly always collective. It is individuals contributing small changes, and there's a build-up of change. All the examples that I mentioned with collective entrepreneurship are also weak in some sense. Only a few examples are really punctuating. Like the French Revolution was very violent and very fast. And so it might be seen as an exception to this rule of that the collective entrepreneurship is not weak, but that it is punctuating. So the French Revolution was definitely punctuating. All the other examples are quite weak. It takes quite some time to really implement these changes and to make these changes. Yeah. So even what we can call the revolution, so industrial revolution, is not really a revolution. It is an evolution, and it is usually referring to weak entrepreneurial activity. The French Revolution is an exception. Examples of this weak entrepreneurial function: agricultural evolution, as it is now preferred to be called, the very first beginning of economic creativity, by creating agricultural societies. The Industrial Revolution I already mentioned. Open source software development, hanging together with the innovation of the smartphone and the internet and all those things. And sharing platforms are also tying in together with this software development. Open source usually. The wiki software by itself is open source software. So this hangs together with each other. It is all an example of weak entrepreneurship that accumulates over time to major change. Punctuating entrepreneurship, we already mentioned quite a few examples of that. events, short episodes that lead to tremendous change, usually centered around an individual. But it usually is leading to very significant change in a very short amount of time. It really gives a shock to the economy. Let's go over some examples. Introduction of coin money, for example, in Lydia. It was an innovation that changed tremendously economic development and changed tremendously the destination of societies. Yeah. I mentioned Augustus as the first Roman emperor, creating the Roman Empire, a way of doing of governing. James Watt with the modification of the steam engine, I already mentioned as well. The big events that happened at the beginning of consumer capitalism, the invention of the first automobile, the electrification of cities, in particular New York. Those were major innovations, and they were there. They were not there one day and the next day they were there. So these are really big punctuating events, really shocking the economy. Henry Ford, I mentioned already. Google's search engine, right? It came about in 1999, and there were many search engines before. They work slightly differently. It is the search engine of Google that really made a big difference and changed a lot and resulted in this possibility of the cloud computing, and the really helped along the platform economy, so to say. Progressive entrepreneurship, that refers to increase of economic wealth that is created. It is positive innovation in some sense. Of course, a lot of things die with entrepreneurship, always things that are no longer valid go away, like the dinosaurs essentially. Well, this is something that always accompanies entrepreneurship, including progressive entrepreneurship, of course. Examples of progressive entrepreneurship, something that you might not recognize, but the nation state was created in 1648 in the treaty in Münster that ended the 30-year war and the 80-year war. And it was the first time that sovereignty was awarded to the state. And so the nation state was created, and this became the big platform on which capitalism was able to emerge. And you needed a strong nation state to really make capitalism happen. And so when you look at the history of Britain, for example, the Industrial Revolution happened because Britain had a strong nation state that was a very fertile ground for innovation, especially in the 18th century. And this hangs together with the fact that the nation state could do things because of the 1648 treaties. The creation of fiat money, worthless coins and pieces of paper in the late 18th century, beginning of 19th century, that is extremely important. That is where the nation state stepped into the economy full force and imposed a much better situation for creating economic wealth. The global plan of Keynes I already mentioned, and I already mentioned also, of course, platform economy, and the next iteration of that will be the green economy, whether we like it or not. We need to go to an economy that is much more efficient, that is circular in nature, and that uses minimally uses resources, and that will be guided by highly technical production technologies based on artificial intelligence. So those things are progressive entrepreneurship. There's also regressive entrepreneurship, innovation that leads nowhere, that leads to decline, that leads to collapse, even lower economic wealth. And unfortunately, that also exists. Right? Again, it is usually something that happens over time. It shows that certain things are not working, and then over time things break down. Yeah? Brexit is an exception. Brexit is not working from day one. I mean, from one moment to the next, you have a collapse in trade that leads to much lower wealth creation. Yeah. So let's talk about aggressive entrepreneurship. Well, the Roman Empire collapsed. What happened after that was the emergence of feudalism. Feudalism was mainly imposed by the desire for power by lords in tribes, and we got a very stagnant economy as a consequence. The feudal economy is widely known for very low productivity, and it is a form of aggressive entrepreneurship. Managerialism after Thatcher in the UK is another example. Financialization is an example, and austerity, and then Brexit. Okay, I want to conclude today with entrepreneurship and freedom. It's always said that freedom is extremely important for the capitalist economy. The capitalist economy promotes entrepreneurship because people are free and they can create these new things. It's a very Schumpeterian understanding of entrepreneurship in that way, of course, and that you are individually free to do things in a different way and to create something brand new, and then you're very successful and everything will be wonderful. Yeah. Freedom is subordinated to institutions. The institutions give you a certain freedom. It allows you to interact in a certain way, and it allows you to determine in a certain way what you can do, right? And we are confronted with that every day in the news. People are not allowed to do certain things somewhere. Go on the street, for example, to protest this. This is an expression of unfreedom, non-freedom. And it goes hand in hand because the same institutional setting will also restrict you through your embeddedness, right? Because you are pushing those institutions away in some sense. You want to change those institutions. But being allowed to make these changes, that is the ultimate expression of that freedom. So the ability to create, the ability to make institutional changes, to be entrepreneurial, that is the true expression of economic freedom. Yeah. And so it is a much more complex relationship between freedom and entrepreneurship than is usually sold. It is not just about individual freedom. That is complete nonsense. It is a certain set of institutions that allow the institutions to be changed. This comes to the fore in the comparison between 18th century Great Britain and 18th century France. Great Britain had the Industrial Revolution because it was diversified, it was open, it was relatively free in a totally different way than France was. France was struggling with a centralized political system that was failing, an economy that was failing. And in this misery, there came about the French Revolution. It was a political revolution. And the philosophers that accompanied the French Revolution, they were political philosophers. They were not economic philosophers, so to say. When we look at 18th century Britain, you see that, especially in Scotland, there was the Scottish Enlightenment, and it was a very different form of enlightenment than the French had. They were basing themselves in talking about the economy. We got Adam Smith was the most important expression of that, in some sense, the most obvious expression of that. Yeah. Another comparison is Silicon Valley versus London in the 1980s. In Silicon Valley, the conditions were there to be creative, to be entrepreneurial, to start up some silly corporation in your garage and then conquer the world. In London, that was much more difficult. It was stifled by bureaucracy, by managerialism. And in London, it did not happen. In London, of course, there was the financial industry that was very successful at that time. But it was not the software industry or the hardware industry. Yeah. All right, so it is the freedom to change institutions that is extremely important, and the institutions themselves have to support this in some sense. It is a very contradictory kind of thing. I mean, institutions have to support their abolition in some sense, their replacement by something else. And the three forms of freedom that we have, individual freedom, freedom of choice, social freedom, the freedom to network, the Burtian freedom. And individual freedom is Jupiterian freedom in some sense. And then this institutional freedom, this Baumollian freedom. Right? I link them back again to the forms of entrepreneurship that we identified. They go hand in hand with these freedoms: individual freedom, social freedom, entrepreneurial freedom. And it all comes down to this entrepreneurial freedom, this freedom to change the institutions. The Baumollian form is in fact the most important form to really instigate change and to push the economy forward. Are there any questions?
Yes, I've got one. So these, I think it's safe to say that these entrepreneurial forces are what drives economic growth. So are all these forces really random, or do they kind of follow some sort of a trend, or do they like just is there like a shock and then they converge to something, or is it like totally random?
No, it's not necessarily random, I believe. Of course, there are random elements. Things happen unexpectedly. Things, we were hit by the COVID pandemic out of the blue. That changes things. Suddenly, there are all kinds of consequences. Institutions are changing because of that. So we are definitely changing in response to that. And it is random. However, major entrepreneurial activity and change is not random at all. It's a sequence of logical events. And when you look back at it, you say, oh, that is very logical that happened, right? For example, the Industrial Revolution is logical. It happened at a certain time in a certain place. And when you look back at it, it is logical that it happened there. The conditions were right in Great Britain at that time. And it took a logical sequence of events and a logical sequence of entrepreneurial activities that resulted there. So random events, yes, they are important. They might trigger certain things, they might push certain things, but it is also the logic of events, the logic of the development itself that guides very much the development, the entrepreneurial activity. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Okay. Some remarks on Brexit from a socio-economic space point of view, so to say. What we have over time, when we look at this entrepreneurial function, what is happening? The socio-economic space is always expanding, right? We went from a feudal economy where there's autarky as the main form of economic activity to the pre-modern economy, which was centered around cities, where the social division of labor was very much embedded into city economies and city governance systems, to classical capitalism, where you got the nation state. It is an expansion of the space. We go from tiny in feudalism to cities, to nation states, to international collaborations between nation states under consumer capitalism, and the global plan economy, as it is also called, that Keynes created after the Second World War, all the way to today, where platform capitalism is operating in one huge global economy, one socioeconomic space. All the other spaces are still there in some sense. We still have the city, we still have the nation state, we still have international treaties. But today, we do business in one huge global space. Now, Brexit is against this tide. Brexit is trying to carve a little piece out of this global economic space and say, this is us, and we want to confine ourselves as much as possible within this tiny little space, because that is really what it comes down to. Even though there's all this talk about global this and global that by these guys that are currently in the British government. But it is all talk, because they know the treaties that they will be able to write, those international treaties, will be inferior to the treaties that the EU has with these major economies. The UK is simply not important enough to grant a lot of rights and a lot of possibilities. Anyway, that's my point of view. So Brexit, in my opinion, is an extremely significant decrease of the economy's scope. And it is exemplified by this reduced trade with the EU that is now clearly a consequence of that, because it was reported what happened in January especially. And Brexit is as a consequence also a hostile act. It is as if you have some kind of economic declaration of war in some sense. I'm now using very extreme words here, but it's very hostile with regard to potential trade partners, right? And so how can the UK still be a trusted trade partner? It goes back to this trust that is at the foundation of the socio-economic space. And it already resulted in the de facto economic, I'm not talking about the political or the social breakup, but the economic breakup of the UK itself by the separation of Northern Ireland from Great Britain by this Irish Sea border that there is now, which is a major obstacle to trade. Anyway, just a few remarks that I wanted to add to this whole presentation about socioeconomic space, because I believe that Brexit very much goes to the core of this understanding. Yeah. Okay. This concludes today's lectures exactly on the dot. Next week, I will start with the mathematical theory. We will build the mathematical building blocks. We will throw out the fuzziness, and we will make everything extremely crisp and representable by mathematical concepts. And then we will build a theory, and we will derive theorems within that theory about all kinds of things. Are there any questions? If there are no questions, I will say thank you for attending, and I will see you next week. Have a good week.